The door of the transport ship opened before I could beg for one more second of air that did not smell like fear. 2 guards held my arms. I did not fight them anymore. I had already tried that, back in the holding cell, back when I still believed someone would listen to me. Now I only tried to breathe. Below the open door was a drop of perhaps 4 meters, and beyond that drop was a valley covered in gray mist, broken trees, and silence that felt wrong. Not peaceful silence, waiting silence. Caliph Vryn, the lead guard said, reading from a small screen without looking at me. Convicted of treason against the ruling council. Sentence: exile to the valley. Sentence to be carried out immediately. I had heard the word treason so many times in the last 10 days that it had stopped meaning anything. I had not committed treason. I had asked a question in the wrong room, in front of the wrong official, about where the funding for our settlement had actually gone. That was all. But questions from a nobody like me were apparently dangerous enough to end a life. Please, I said, and hated how small my voice sounded. There has to be another way. The guard finally looked at me. For one heartbeat I thought I saw something like pity in his eyes. Then it was gone. Nobody comes back from the valley, he said. Make your peace. They did not push me. They did not need to. The floor beneath me tilted, and I fell. The drop was not long, but it felt endless. The wind screaming past my ears, the mist rising up to swallow me. I hit a slope of wet leaves and rolled, pain flashing through my shoulder and my side, and then I stopped, flat on my back, staring up at a sky the color of old bruises. Above me, far above, the transport ship turned and left without another sound. No siren, no final word, just gone, as if I had already stopped existing. I lay there for a long moment, waiting to feel something enormous and terrible come for me. That was what the stories said happened in Monster Valley. Within an hour, they said, sometimes within minutes. Instead, I heard something small and strange. Birds. Actual birds, singing somewhere in the broken trees, as if this was an ordinary forest and not a graveyard with a reputation. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, wincing, and looked around. Twisted black trunks, vines thick as my arm, a layer of fog that clung to the ground like it was afraid of the sky, and far off, through a gap in the trees, a thin gray line rising into the air. Smoke. My mind refused it at first. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone had built it, tended it, kept it burning. Fire meant a person. Nobody lived in Monster Valley. Nobody survived Monster Valley. That was the entire point of the place. And yet there it was, a thin, patient line of smoke, rising as if it had been rising for years. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I would probably be dead before I reached it, torn apart by whatever had earned this place its name. But staying where I had landed, alone and unarmed, felt like waiting to die instead of trying to live, and some stubborn part of me, the same part that had asked one question too many, in front of one official too powerful, refused to simply wait. I got to my feet. My legs shook, but they held. I began walking toward the smoke. The forest did not feel empty. I could sense it the way you sense a room where someone is standing very still in the dark. Twice I heard something large moving through the undergrowth, matching my pace from a distance, never quite showing itself. Each time my heart tried to climb out through my throat. Each time, whatever it was simply moved on, as if I was not interesting enough to bother with. That should have comforted me. It did not. It made me feel like prey that had not yet been noticed by the right predator. I walked for what felt like an hour, though I had no way to measure it. The mist thinned as I got closer to the smoke, and the trees opened into a wide clearing beside a shallow stream. There was a fire pit ringed with stones. There was a shelter built from branches and something that looked like stretched animal hide. There were tools, crude but clearly made with care, laid out on a flat rock like a person had just stepped away from them. And there was a figure crouched by the stream, filling a container with water, back turned to me. I stopped walking. Every instinct told me to run, to hide, to do anything except announce myself to whatever this creature was, but my foot came down on a dry branch, and it cracked loud enough to silence the birds. The figure went still. Then, slowly, it stood and turned around. It was not a monster. It was a person, tall, with skin a shade I had never seen on any species from my part of the galaxy, hair dark and cut short, eyes the color of the sky before a storm, 2 arms, 2 legs, a face built for expression the way mine was, though the shape of it was strange to me, sharper in some places and softer in others. He wore clothing stitched together from mismatched materials, and there was a long, thin scar along one forearm that had healed a long time ago. He looked at me the way you look at something you did not expect to see twice in one lifetime. "Well," he said, in my own language, though the accent was rough and strange, like he had learned it a long time ago and rarely had reason to use it since. "You're new." I did not answer. I could not. My legs had decided, without consulting me, that this was the moment to stop working, and I sank down onto the wet ground, staring up at him. He did not rush toward me. He did not raise a weapon, though I could see one within easy reach, leaning against a log by the fire. He simply crouched down a careful distance away, the way you might approach an animal you did not want to frighten, and studied me with something that was not quite pity and not quite curiosity, but sat somewhere between the two. "They usually don't send them out here alone anymore," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Guess old habits don't die. What are you?" I finally managed. My voice cracked on the words. He tilted his head slightly, as if the question amused him in a tired sort of way. "Human," he said. "You've probably never heard of us. Most people out here haven't, or they've heard the wrong things." "Human," I repeated. The word meant nothing to me, and yet something in the back of my mind, some half-remembered lesson from a history class I had barely paid attention to, stirred at the sound of it. A word from old warnings. A word tied to a story about a mistake an older empire had made a long time ago, one that was rarely spoken about in polite company. "You're going to be fine," he said. And there was something steady in the way he said it, something that made me want, foolishly, to believe him. First day out here is the hardest. After that it gets easier, not easy, easier. "They told me nothing survives here," I whispered. He almost smiled, though there was no real humor in it, only the ghost of something old and tired. "They tell everyone that," he said. "It's not entirely a lie. It's just not the whole truth either." He stood, offering me a hand. I stared at it for a long moment, at the strange proportions of his fingers, at the small marks and calluses that told the story of years I could not begin to guess at. Then, because the alternative was staying on the wet ground while the mist crept back in around me, I took it. His grip was firm and warm, and he pulled me up as easily as if I weighed nothing at all. "My name is Ethan," he said. "Ethan Marlowe, and whatever they told you about this place, whatever they told you about me, you're going to want to unlearn most of it, starting now." Behind him, the fire crackled softly, and somewhere far off in the mist, something large let out a low sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a call, and Ethan did not even glance toward it. He watched me instead, waiting to see if I would run. I did not run. I did not know it yet, standing there soaked and shaking and utterly out of my depth, but that single choice, to stay instead of flee, was going to change everything I thought I understood about monsters, about humans, and about the valley that was supposed to be my grave. "Come on," Ethan said, turning back toward the fire. "You're freezing, and we have a lot to talk about before dark." I followed him, because there was nowhere else in the entire galaxy left for me to go. The fire was smaller than I expected, but the heat from it reached deep into my bones in a way that felt almost embarrassing, like my body had been waiting all day for permission to stop being afraid. Ethan handed me a cup made from something hard and dark, filled with water that had been boiled clean. I drank it too fast and coughed, and he watched me with the patient amusement of someone who had clearly done this before, welcomed someone new into this place before, sat across a fire from a stranger who did not yet understand where they had landed. "How many others have you found?" I asked, once my throat stopped burning. "Others like me." From outside. He was quiet for a moment, turning a stick over in his hands, feeding the fire without needing to look at what he was doing. "A few," he said. "Not many make it this far. Most exiles land in the outer part of the valley, closer to the drop zone, and the things out there find them before they find their feet. You got lucky, or maybe you got smart. Either one works." "Lucky," I said. "Definitely not smart. I nearly turned back twice." "Turning back would have gotten you killed faster," he said. "Standing still in the open is the worst thing you can do out here. Doesn't matter what you're standing still for. Fear, hope, prayer. The valley doesn't care about your reasons." I studied him across the flames. There was a stillness to him that unsettled me, not because it felt dangerous, though I suspected it could be, but because it felt earned. Like a man who had been afraid so many times that fear itself had become just another weather condition to plan around. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Long enough that I stopped counting the way you're probably counting," he said. "Long enough that this fire pit isn't the first one I've built, and it won't be the last." "And you built all this," I said, gesturing at the shelter, the tools, the small orderly camp that felt more like a home than anything I had lived in during the last frightened days of my old life. "Alone?" Something crossed his face then, brief and complicated, gone before I could fully read it. "Not always alone," he said. "There were others, once. My people did not come here the way you did, thrown down from a ship with a guard reading a sentence off a screen. We came here in chains, a long time before I was ever born, dumped on this moon by an empire that decided we were more trouble than we were worth and did not have the stomach to simply end us outright. So they buried us here instead, in a place they assumed would finish the job for them." I sat very still, listening. Outside the ring of firelight, the forest continued its low, restless murmur, but for the first time since I had fallen from that ship, I was not thinking about the dangers hiding in it. "Your entire species," I said slowly, "exiled, all at once." "The ones who survived the first landing, yes," he said. "Ships full of us, dropped across different parts of this moon, like seeds scattered by someone who didn't much care where they landed, only that they landed far away. Some groups didn't make it past the first winter. Some did. My family's line came from a group that did." "That's monstrous," I whispered, and then winced at the word, aware suddenly of how strange it sounded coming out of my mouth in this particular place. Ethan huffed out something that was almost a laugh, though there was no real warmth in it. "Funny thing about that word," he said. "You'll hear it used differently once you've been here a while. The people who named this place Monster Valley weren't thinking about the creatures in these woods. Not really. They were thinking about us." I did not understand. Not fully. Not yet. But something about the way he said it settled into my chest like a stone. "They wanted a graveyard," I said, "and you refused to be one." He looked at me then, properly looked at me, the firelight catching something old and unreadable in his eyes. "That's about the shape of it," he said. "It took generations. A lot of people didn't make it who deserved to, but eventually, the ones of us who did make it stopped trying to simply survive the valley and started trying to understand it instead. That's the difference that matters out here. Survival keeps you alive for a season. Understanding keeps you alive for a lifetime." He stood then, walking a few steps toward the edge of the firelight, and gestured for me to follow. I hesitated only a second before rising and joining him. "Look there," he said, pointing into the mist toward a low ridge in the distance, barely visible in the fading light. "See the shape along the top of that ridge?" I squinted and slowly made out a long, low silhouette moving with careful, unhurried steps, easily 3 times the size of either of us, its outline strange and heavy in a way that made my skin crawl instinctively. "That's a ridgeback," Ethan said. "Big, slow, mostly eats the vine growth that covers the eastern slopes. It could crush either one of us without much effort if it wanted to. It's never once bothered me. Why not? Because it doesn't see me as food, and it doesn't see me as a threat, he said. Most of what lives in this valley isn't hunting for the joy of it. They're surviving too, same as us, in whatever way the valley left available to them. The real danger isn't the size of the thing you meet, it's whether you understand what it wants. And if you don't understand, then you learn quickly, he said, or you don't get a second chance to learn slowly. We stood in silence for a while, watching the ridgeback move along the horizon until it disappeared into a fold of the land. The fear in my chest had not vanished, but it had changed shape somehow, become something quieter, something closer to caution than panic. "Why are you helping me?" I finally asked. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be exactly what they said I was on that ship. A traitor, someone dangerous." Ethan considered the question longer than I expected him to, as if it deserved real weight rather than a quick, comfortable answer. "Because somebody helped my family once, a long time before I was born," he said. "An old woman from one of the other scattered groups found my great-grandfather half-starved in a ravine during his first winter here, and decided, for reasons she never fully explained even to her own children, that he was worth the risk of helping. He lived because a stranger decided his life mattered more than her own safety for one single afternoon. Everything I have, this fire, this shelter, the fact that I'm standing here at all, traces back to that one choice she made." He looked at me, and there was something almost challenging in his gaze, as if daring me to dismiss what he was about to say next. "I don't know what you did to end up here," he said. "Maybe you did something terrible, maybe you didn't, but I know what it looks like when a system decides someone is disposable, and I've spent my whole life in a place built entirely out of people that system tried to throw away. If I only helped the ones I was certain deserved it, I wouldn't have helped anyone at all, including myself, on the days it mattered most." I did not have an answer for that. I only had the sudden, unfamiliar sting behind my eyes, the kind that comes when kindness catches you completely unprepared for it. We returned to the fire as the last light drained out of the sky, and Ethan began teaching me, without any ceremony, the way you might teach someone who simply needed to know in order to see morning. Which plants along the stream were safe to eat, and which ones would make me violently ill within the hour. Which tracks in the mud belonged to creatures that avoided people, and which belonged to creatures that did not. How to read the particular silence that fell over the birds right before something larger moved through the trees, a silence different from ordinary quiet, one you had to learn to feel rather than simply hear. "You won't master any of this tonight," he said, banking the fire lower as true darkness settled over the valley. "Nobody does. But you'll remember enough to make tomorrow a little less likely to kill you, and that's really all any of us can ask of a first day." "Is it always like this?" I asked, wrapping the blanket he had given me tighter around my shoulders. "This calm. I expected constant danger. I expected to be running the moment I landed." "There's danger," he said, "real danger, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the stories your people tell about this place, the ones that make it sound like endless chaos from the first second to the last, those stories exist because it's easier for the ones who threw us here to imagine total disaster than to imagine we built something real out of the wreckage. It's more comfortable for them to believe this valley simply destroys everyone in it. The truth is a little more complicated and a little more uncomfortable for them if they ever let themselves think about it honestly." I looked out at the dark shapes of the trees, no longer quite as frightening as they had been only hours earlier, though far from familiar. "How many of you are out here?" I asked. "Humans, I mean. All these generations later." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and something in his expression grew distant, the way a person looks when they are counting losses instead of numbers. "Enough," he said finally. "Scattered across different parts of the valley, mostly keeping to smaller groups now, rather than one large settlement, for reasons that took a long time and a lot of hard lessons to learn. You'll meet some of them eventually, if you decide to stay long enough to be worth introducing around." "Do I have a choice?" I asked quietly. "About staying?" He met my eyes across the dying fire, and for the first time since I had stumbled into his camp, his expression softened into something that looked almost like hope, careful and guarded, but real. "Everyone who lands here has a choice," he said. "The valley doesn't force anyone to become anything. It only shows you, very quickly, exactly what you're willing to become in order to keep breathing. What you do with that knowledge afterward, that part's always been up to the person standing in front of the fire." Above us, through a gap in the canopy, unfamiliar stars had begun to appear, and somewhere far off in the darkness, that same low sound from earlier rolled across the valley again, no closer than before, no more threatening than a distant storm. I did not sleep easily that first night, but for the first time since the guards had thrown me from that ship, I slept believing I might actually see morning, and that belief, fragile and new as it was, felt like the first true gift anyone had given me in a very long time. Morning in the valley did not arrive gently. It arrived the way a curtain gets pulled back too fast, gray light flooding through the canopy all at once, and I woke with my heart already racing before I remembered where I was. Ethan was already awake, crouched by the ashes of the fire, rebuilding it with the same unhurried focus he seemed to bring to everything. He glanced at me as I sat up, stiff and sore from sleeping on the ground for the first time in my life. "We're not staying here today," he said. "There's someone I want you to meet, and it's a fair walk from this camp." "Someone else survived," I said, still turning the idea over in my mind, still not fully able to believe it. "Another human." "Grace," he said, feeding a thin branch into the growing flame. "She's been out here almost as long as I have, runs a camp a few hours east, closer to the old crash site. If you're going to understand what this valley actually is, rather than what it looks like on the surface, she's the one who can show you better than I can." I did not ask what the crash site was. I had learned, in the short time I had known him, that Ethan answered questions in his own time, when the answer would actually mean something rather than simply filling silence. We ate a quick meal of something that tasted faintly like dried fruit, though Ethan assured me it had grown from a root rather than any tree, and then we set out through the mist while the light was still soft and gray. Walking beside him during daylight taught me more about the valley than the entire night before had. He moved differently than I did, reading the ground the way I might read a written page, noticing broken stems and disturbed leaves and faint impressions in the mud that told him, without needing to stop and think about it, exactly what had passed through recently and roughly how long ago. "You said the ones who threw your people here wanted a graveyard," I said, as we crossed a narrow stream on a fallen log. "But you never told me why. What could an entire species do to earn something like that?" Ethan was quiet for a while, long enough that I thought he might simply let the question pass unanswered. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual steadiness. "We didn't do anything. At first," he said. "Not in the way you mean. We were simply useful to an empire that needed workers, needed soldiers, needed a species desperate enough to accept terrible conditions without much complaint. For a long time, that's all we were to them, useful. And then we started asking for things in return, fair treatment, a say in our own future, the same rights the empire gave its own citizens. And they refused, I guessed. They refused, and we kept asking anyway, louder each time, until refusing us quietly stopped being an option they were comfortable with," he said. "An empire that built its comfort on the backs of people it considered lesser does not enjoy being reminded that those people can think and organize and eventually demand better. We became inconvenient. Inconvenient people get erased, one way or another, when the ones in power decide erasing them is easier than treating them fairly." I thought of the official's face back home, the flicker of irritation when I had asked my one small question about missing funds, the speed with which an entire tribunal had assembled to make sure that irritation never had to be addressed again. "I understand that better than I wish I did," I said quietly. Ethan glanced at me, something like recognition passing between us that needed no further explanation. We walked for what felt like hours, the terrain shifting beneath us from soft, wet ground to rocky slopes and back again, the valley revealing itself in pieces. I saw creatures I had no names for, some small and quick, darting through underbrush without acknowledging us at all, others larger and slower, watching from a careful distance with an intelligence in their eyes that unsettled me more than any teeth or claws could have. "Not everything out here is natural," Ethan said, catching me staring at a creature with strange metallic patches along its hide, patches that caught the light in a way that felt wrong against the organic curve of its body. This valley wasn't only a dumping ground for people the old empires wanted rid of. It was also a dumping ground for things they wanted to forget they ever made. "What do you mean?" "Failed experiments," he said. "Old weapons projects that got shut down before they were finished, or finished and then deemed too dangerous to keep. Rather than properly destroy the results, whoever ran this moon back then simply released them into the valley and let them fend for themselves, the same way they did with us. Some of those experiments didn't survive long. Others adapted, changed, became something the original creators probably never anticipated and definitely never intended." I looked again at the metallic patched creature as it slipped back into the tree line, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. "So the monsters in Monster Valley," I said slowly, "some of them were made monsters. On purpose." "Some were," Ethan said. "Most of what's out here now, though, is just the valley continuing on the way anything left alone long enough continues on, growing, adapting, finding a balance nobody designed, but that works anyway. That's the part the Empire never understood, and still doesn't. They thought they were creating a wasteland. What they actually created was an ecosystem too complicated and too resilient for them to ever fully control again, which is exactly why they've never sent anyone back to properly reclaim it." We crested a low hill, and below us, nestled into a wide clearing beside the wreckage of something enormous and ancient, half swallowed by vines and time, was a second camp, larger than Ethan's, with several structures built from salvaged material and a garden of neat, careful rows cut into the earth. A woman stepped out from one of the structures as we approached, tall and weathered, with streaks of gray through dark hair and eyes that studied me with the same careful assessment Ethan's had, the evaluation of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust first impressions. "Ethan," she said, nodding once, then turning her full attention to me. "And who's this?" "Caliph," Ethan said. "Landed yesterday, made it to my camp on her own before I even had to go looking." Something in the woman's expression shifted at that. A flicker of surprise quickly folded away behind practiced composure. "That's rare," she said. "Most don't make it that far without help their first day." She extended a hand toward me, and I copied Ethan's earlier gesture, taking it carefully. Grace Holloway, welcome to the part of the galaxy nobody wants to admit still exists." "Ethan told me a little about how your people ended up here," I said, "about the exile, about the experiments." Grace's mouth tightened slightly, and she exchanged a glance with Ethan that carried some unspoken weight between them. "He's not wrong about any of it," she said, "but there's more to the valley than old grievances, if that's what you're expecting from this visit. Come on, let me show you something." She led us through the camp, past the garden and the structures, toward the crashed wreckage I had noticed from the hilltop. Up close, it was even larger than it had appeared, a hull of some enormous vessel, corroded and overgrown, half sunk into the earth, as if the valley itself had slowly been swallowing it for generations. "This was one of the original transport ships," Grace said, running a hand along the corroded metal. "The ones that first brought my ancestors here, back when this was nothing but a punishment, with no plan attached to it. It crashed on landing, killed most of the people aboard outright. The survivors buried their dead here, and then built the first real settlement around the wreck, because it was the only shelter solid enough to protect them from that first terrible winter." She looked at me, something fierce and proud settling into her expression. "Every generation since has added something to what those first survivors started," she said. "Better shelters, better ways to read the land, better understanding of which creatures could be lived alongside rather than simply feared. What you're seeing now isn't just a camp, Caliph. It's the result of more than 100 years of people refusing to let a punishment define the entirety of who they were allowed to become. I ran my fingers over the cool, pitted metal of the wreck, trying to imagine the scale of what she was describing. Generations of loss and stubborn survival compressed into a single overgrown hull. Why keep it standing? I asked. Why not build somewhere entirely new, away from the reminder? Because forgetting where you came from is how you end up repeating the worst parts of it, Grace said simply. We keep the wreck standing so nobody who lives here ever mistakes comfort for safety. The empire that did this to us hasn't changed its mind about people like us. It's only ever been waiting for a reason to stop pretending we don't exist. Something in the way she said it, quiet and certain, made the back of my neck prickle. You think they'll come back, I said. The Empire. You think they'll try to reclaim the valley? Grace and Ethan exchanged another glance, longer this time, and I understood, watching them, that this was not an idle fear they were sharing with me. This was something they had been discussing between themselves for longer than my one day here. There have been signs, Ethan said carefully. Scout ships passing high overhead more often than usual these past few months. Old patrol routes reopening near the edge of the exclusion zone. Nothing confirmed yet, but the valley's been quiet and forgotten for a long time, and quiet, forgotten places have a way of becoming interesting again the moment someone in power decides they need a distraction, or a resource, or a message to send. A message, I repeated slowly, thinking of the sentence read to me on that transport ship, the casual certainty in the guard's voice that nobody ever came back from here. You mean a message about what happens to people who don't stay disposed of? Exactly that, Grace said, which is part of why it matters that you made it here, Caliph, and part of why it matters what you decide to do with the time you have now that you're alive to decide anything at all. Every person who survives this valley and thrives in it is proof that the story they tell about this place, and about us, was always a lie built to keep people afraid and obedient. Proof like that tends to make people in power very uncomfortable. We spent the remainder of the day in Grace's camp, and I watched, fascinated, as the ordinary rhythms of survival unfolded around me. Children I had not expected to see ran between the structures, born and raised in this place with no memory of anywhere else, laughing in a way that felt entirely at odds with everything I had been told to believe about Monster Valley. An older man tended the garden with careful, practiced hands, occasionally trading quiet jokes with Grace in a language I did not fully understand, but that carried warmth in every syllable regardless. A group returned near dusk from some kind of hunting expedition, moving with the same confident, careful awareness Ethan had shown me the night before, creatures of the valley clearly respected rather than simply feared. It was, I realized slowly over the course of that long afternoon, a community. Not a graveyard, not a wasteland of desperate survival scraped together from nothing, a genuine, functioning community built by people the galaxy had tried its hardest to erase, standing now in defiance of every intention behind their exile. As evening approached and Ethan prepared to lead me back toward his own camp for the night, Grace pulled me aside for a moment, her expression serious in a way that felt different from the wary assessment she had greeted me with hours earlier. You said your crime back home was asking a question someone powerful didn't want answered, she said. That true? Yes, I said. Then you already understand something most exiles take months to learn, she said. The people who run things out there don't fear violence nearly as much as they fear being seen clearly. You survived a fall meant to kill you, and you're standing in the middle of a community they insist doesn't exist. That alone makes you dangerous to them, whether you ever raise a hand against anyone or not. Her words settled into me as Ethan and I began the long walk back through the darkening valley, the mist rising again around our feet as the light faded. I did not yet know how right she was, or how soon I would be tested by exactly the kind of danger she had been quietly warning me about. But something in her certainty stayed with me through the entire walk home, a small hard seed of understanding that the valley I had been thrown into as a punishment might, before long, become something the empire that exiled me would have very good reason to fear. The sound woke me before Ethan did, a distant droning hum that did not belong to anything living, cutting through the pre-dawn quiet like a blade through fabric. I sat up fast, heart hammering, and found Ethan already standing at the edge of the camp, head tilted toward the sky, every line of his body gone tense and still, in a way I had not seen from him before, not even that first frightened moment when I had stumbled into his clearing. "Ship," he said, before I could ask. "Low orbit, coming down fast. That's not a scout pattern, that's a landing approach." My stomach dropped. "They're coming for me." "Maybe," he said. "Maybe they're coming for the valley in general, and you're just the reason they finally decided the timing was right. Either way, we don't have the luxury of waiting around to find out which." He moved quickly then, gathering supplies with the efficient economy of someone who had clearly rehearsed this exact scenario in his mind more than once, even if he had never truly expected to need it. I scrambled to help, though my hands shook badly enough that I dropped nearly everything I tried to pick up. "Grace needs to know," I said. "She'll know soon enough," Ethan said grimly. "That hum carries a long way out here. Half the valley probably heard it." We moved out from the camp within minutes, Ethan leading us along a route that avoided the open ground, sticking to tree cover and low ridgelines that would keep us hidden from anything scanning from above. The forest, which had felt almost peaceful the day before, now seemed to hold its breath along with us, birds falling silent, the usual restless murmur of the undergrowth gone eerily quiet. "They'll have brought trained retrieval teams," Ethan said as we moved. "Not soldiers exactly. Specialists, trained to move through hostile terrain and recover specific targets with minimal complication. If they came for you specifically, they'll have a tracking signature from your exile pod, something to follow." "How do you know all this?" I asked, breathless from the pace he was setting. "Because it's happened before," he said. "Not often, but often enough that every camp in this valley has a plan for exactly this kind of morning." We reached higher ground, perhaps an hour later, a rocky outcrop that gave a clear view down across a wide stretch of the valley below. Ethan crouched at the edge, and I followed his gaze to see it, a sleek, dark shape resting in a clearing not far from where I had first landed, its hull still ticking with heat, a ramp lowered, and figures already moving out from it in organized formation. 5 of them, armored, moving with the disciplined coordination of people who had trained for exactly this kind of terrain. At their center walked a taller figure, whose posture radiated the particular confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. "That's them," I whispered, though I did not know how I knew it, some instinct recognizing danger before my mind had fully processed the sight. "That's a retrieval team. Commander-class insignia on the one in front," Ethan said, his voice grim. "They sent someone with real authority. That's not standard for a routine cleanup. That tells me this is about more than just you, Caliph. Someone up there is worried about exactly the kind of thing Grace warned you about last night. Proof that this valley isn't the wasteland they've been telling everyone it is." Below us, the commander raised an arm, and the formation spread out, beginning a methodical sweep of the surrounding terrain, moving with the confidence of people who believed nothing in this valley could seriously threaten them. They were wrong, and it did not take long for the valley to prove it. The first sign came from the tree line at the formation's flank, a low rumbling growl that sent 2 of the armored figures spinning toward the sound, weapons raised. From the underbrush emerged one of the creatures I had learned to recognize over the past 2 days, larger than a person, moving with deliberate, unhurried menace, clearly aware of the intruders, and clearly unimpressed by their weapons. The soldiers opened fire, and the creature retreated into the trees rather than pressing the attack, but the damage to their formation was done. What had been an orderly sweep dissolved into a wary, defensive posture, the soldiers now watching the tree line as much as the open ground, their confidence visibly shaken. "They came in loud," Ethan murmured, something almost like satisfaction in his voice despite the danger. Loud draws attention out here. Everything with ears for a mile around just learned exactly where they are. We need to warn Grace, I said, and the others. If that commander is looking for proof this valley has people living in it, finding a settlement would be exactly what he's hoping for. Agreed, Ethan said, already moving. But we need to be smart about how we do it. If they're tracking your exile signature, moving toward you draws them straight to Grace's camp, and I am not leading an armed retrieval team to a place full of children. We doubled back along a different route, circling wide of the retrieval team's position, moving as quickly and quietly as the terrain allowed. My mind raced the entire time, turning over Grace's words from the night before, about being dangerous simply by existing, about proof and fear and everything an empire could not tolerate seeing clearly. We found Grace already moving to meet us halfway, several others from her camp with her, all of them carrying tools that had clearly been repurposed for something more serious than gardening or building. You heard it too, Ethan said. Whole Valley heard it, Grace said grimly. Commander-class ship, judging by the engine signature, that's not a routine sweep. Her eyes moved to me, sharp and assessing. They're here for her then, or here because of her. Both, probably, Ethan said. I want the children moved deeper into the valley, toward the old shelter caves, now before that patrol gets any closer to camp. Grace nodded once, already turning to relay instructions to the others with the brisk efficiency of someone who had rehearsed evacuation plans more times than she likely wanted to admit. Within minutes, a group had split off, moving quickly and quietly toward safety, while those remaining gathered around Ethan and Grace with grim, determined focus. What's the plan? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded even now, after everything I had already survived. Ethan looked at me, and something in his expression softened slightly, even amid the tension gripping the rest of his body. The plan is that you don't have to fight anyone, Caliph. This isn't your battle to win alone, and nobody here expects you to. It became my battle the moment they threw me off that ship, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my own voice. I asked one question back home, and an entire system decided I was worth erasing for it. I am done being someone things simply happen to. Tell me what I can do. Grace studied me for a long moment, then exchanged a glance with Ethan that seemed to settle something between them. There's a narrow pass about a quarter mile from here, she said. Steep walls on both sides, single approach in and out. If that patrol keeps moving the direction they're headed, they'll have to come through it to reach any part of the valley worth investigating further. It's the kind of ground that favors people who know it, not people who don't. You want to trap them there, I said. I want to convince them this valley isn't worth the cost of pursuing, Ethan said. There's a difference, and it matters. We're not looking to destroy anyone today, Caliph. We're looking to make sure that Commander walks away from here utterly certain that whatever report he files, it needs to say this valley is not worth another visit. The plan came together quickly after that, built from generations of accumulated knowledge about the terrain and the creatures that called it home. Several of Grace's people moved ahead to the narrow pass, using calls and signals I did not fully understand to draw the attention of certain creatures in the area, the same kind that had already spooked the retrieval team once already. Others positioned themselves along the high ground overlooking the pass, ready to make the approach feel far more watched and far more dangerous than a simple head count would suggest. I stayed close to Ethan throughout, following his instructions exactly, learning in real time the kind of quiet, careful movement that meant the difference between staying hidden and being found. My heart never stopped racing, but somewhere beneath the fear, something else was growing too, a fierce and unfamiliar resolve that had nothing to do with survival alone. The retrieval team entered the pass perhaps an hour later, exactly as Grace had predicted. Their formation tightened defensively after their earlier encounter, weapons raised, movements sharp with barely controlled tension. From my position on the high ground, pressed flat against cool stone beside Ethan, I watched the commander at their center scan the walls above with an expression that had lost all its earlier confidence. What happened next unfolded quickly, and though I had feared, somewhere in the back of my mind, that it would become something violent and terrible, it did not. The valley itself did the work, low growls echoing from multiple directions at once, careful shifts of movement in the tree line above the pass, the occasional flash of something large and clearly capable moving just at the edge of visibility. Grace's people added to the effect with calls and signals timed perfectly to suggest a far larger presence surrounding the retrieval team than truly existed. The commander held his ground longer than I expected, barking sharp commands to his formation, clearly weighing the value of pressing forward against the mounting evidence that this valley was nothing like the empty, harmless wasteland his briefing had likely described. It was Ethan, finally, who tipped the balance, stepping deliberately into a patch of clear light on the ridge above the pass, allowing himself to be seen. "You're a long way from anywhere that wants you," Ethan called down, his voice carrying clearly through the narrow stone corridor. "Whatever you came here looking for, I'd think carefully about whether it's worth what this valley is going to cost you to take it." The commander's head snapped up, finding him instantly, and for a long, tense moment, nobody moved at all. I held my breath, watching, waiting to see which way this single frozen moment would break. Then, slowly, the commander lowered his weapon, though his expression remained hard and furious. He said something sharp to his formation, and the retrieval team began a careful, watchful retreat back the way they had come, weapons still raised, eyes still scanning the ridgelines, but moving nonetheless, away from the pass, away from Grace's camp, away from everything they had come to find. I did not fully breathe again until the sound of their ship's engines rose into the sky sometime later and faded into the distance, leaving the valley in its familiar, watchful silence once more. "They'll be back," Grace said quietly, once it was clear the immediate danger had passed. "Not soon, maybe, but a commander who comes home empty-handed doesn't simply let it go, especially not when what he failed to bring back is proof his empire's convenient old lie has been unraveling out here for generations." I looked out over the valley, the mist beginning to rise again with the fading light, and felt something settle into place inside me that had not been there before that morning, something steadier and far less afraid than the girl who had fallen from that transport ship only days earlier. "Then we'll be ready," I said, "when they do." Ethan looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite pride, but sat somewhere warm and real between the two. The days that followed the retrieval team's retreat did not bring the relief I had hoped for. Instead, they brought a different kind of tension, quieter but no less real, the sense of a held breath that refused to fully release. Ethan and Grace kept watch on the sky more than usual, and word spread quickly between the scattered camps of the valley, carried by runners and signal fires, and the kind of careful, practiced communication that generations of survival had built into something almost like instinct. Everyone understood, without needing to be told twice, what a commander returning empty-handed to his superiors might set in motion. It was on the 5th day after the retreat that the second ship came, and this time there was no mistaking its purpose. It was larger, heavier, moving with none of the careful reconnaissance pattern the first ship had used. This one came down hard and fast, and even from the distance of Ethan's camp, I could feel the ground tremble faintly with the weight of its landing. "That's not a retrieval ship," Grace said, when she arrived at our camp within the hour, her expression grim in a way I had not yet seen from her. "That's a full deployment vessel. They're not here to quietly collect one exile anymore, Calith. They're here to make an example." My chest tightened at the words, old fear rushing back in despite everything I had learned, everything I had already survived. An example of what? "Of what happens to a place that embarrasses them," Ethan said quietly. The commander went home with nothing to show for his trip, and somewhere up that chain of command, someone decided the story of this valley needed a different ending than the one it's been writing for itself all these years. The gathering that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed in my short time in the valley. Camps that had operated separately for years, sometimes for reasons of old caution as much as simple distance, coming together at Grace's clearing within a single day, drawn by the shared understanding that whatever was coming would not spare anyone who stood apart from the others. I watched, humbled and a little overwhelmed, as generations of accumulated knowledge poured into a single collective plan, elders who remembered old lessons from crises decades past, standing alongside younger survivors, eager to prove the strength this place had built into them. Ethan and Grace moved through it all with the calm, practiced authority of people who had earned every measure of trust placed in them, and slowly, piece by piece, a strategy began to take shape. "They'll expect force," an older man named Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of long experience. "A show of strength, meant to frighten us into surrender before real fighting even starts. That's how empires like this one operate. Fear first, force only if fear fails to do the job for them. Then we don't give them fear to work with," I said, before I had fully decided to speak at all. Every eye in the gathering turned toward me, and for a moment, my old instinct to shrink back, to stay quiet, to avoid becoming the reason for anyone's attention, rose up fierce and familiar. I pushed past it. They're counting on this valley looking exactly like the wasteland they've always claimed it to be, right up until the moment their fear is supposed to take hold. What if instead, the very first thing they see is proof that the wasteland never existed at all? Grace studied me for a long moment, something calculating and approving moving behind her eyes. "Go on," she said. "They landed in the open, near the crash site," I said, thinking quickly now, the plan forming faster than I could fully examine it. "If we let them see this valley exactly as it is, not hidden, not frightened, but organized, capable, clearly thriving despite everything meant to destroy it, that tells a very different story than the one they came prepared to write. An empire that built its power on convincing people like me that questioning it meant erasure does not know what to do when the people it erased simply refuse to disappear in front of witnesses." "You want to meet them openly," Ethan said slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "Not with an ambush, with the truth. The truth and every advantage this valley has taught us to use," I said. "Let them see the ridgebacks moving freely alongside us instead of hunting us. Let them see the gardens, the shelters, the children who've never known anywhere else and are thriving anyway. Let their own recording devices, whatever they brought to document our supposed savagery, capture exactly how wrong that story has always been." A murmur moved through the gathering, uncertain at first, then growing steadier as the idea took hold. Grace exchanged a long look with Ethan, and something passed between them, an old, careful weighing of risk against possibility that clearly came from decades of hard-learned caution. "It's dangerous," Grace said finally. "If we're wrong about how they'll react, we'll have given them exactly the clear target they came here hoping to find." "We're already a target," I said. "The question isn't whether we're at risk. It's whether we spend that risk hiding, the way they've always expected us to, or whether we spend it showing them something they can't simply erase with one more convenient report." In the end, it was Ethan who tipped the decision, the same way he had tipped the confrontation days earlier, though this time with words rather than a step into the light. "My family survived exile here because a stranger once decided a life mattered more than her own safety," he said, looking around the gathered faces, generations of survival written into every one of them. "Every one of us standing here exists because somebody, somewhere along the way, refused to simply accept the ending that was handed to them. I think it's time the empire that threw us away finally saw exactly what refusing that ending has built. Fort." The decision settled over the gathering like something solid and shared, fear transforming, slowly but unmistakably, into resolve. We moved out toward the crash site the following morning, not in secret, not through hidden trails, but along the open paths of the valley itself, families and elders and hunters walking together in a procession that felt less like an approach to danger and more like a declaration. Ethan walked beside me the entire way, and Grace led at the front, her posture unshaken despite everything at stake. The deployment forces had established a perimeter around their landed ship, soldiers in heavier armor than the retrieval team had worn, weapons ready, clearly prepared for exactly the kind of ambush that had turned their commander back days earlier. What they were not prepared for was what actually came walking toward them from the mist, unhurried, unarmed in any obvious sense, entire families moving with the calm certainty of people standing on ground that had always, truly, belonged to them. The confusion on the soldiers' faces was almost immediate, weapons wavering slightly as they struggled to reconcile the disciplined, organized approach in front of them with whatever briefing had prepared them for savage chaos instead. A figure stepped forward from among the armored ranks, and I recognized, with a chill, the same commander from days earlier, his expression now carrying something sharper and more dangerous than simple frustration. "You've made a mistake, showing yourselves so openly," he said, his voice carrying across the open ground. "This changes nothing about why we're here." "It changes everything," I said, stepping forward before fear could stop me, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect. "You came looking for proof this valley destroys everyone thrown into it. Instead, you're looking at exactly the opposite. Whatever report you file today, it will have to explain why an entire community your empire insists could not possibly exist is standing here in front of you, alive and thriving, generations deep." The commander's jaw tightened, his eyes moving over the gathered crowd, taking in details I could see him struggling to process: the children, the elders, the clear evidence of years of careful, deliberate building rather than desperate scattered survival. "Your empire built its power partly on the story that people like these," I continued, gesturing toward Ethan, toward Grace, toward everyone gathered around me, were disposable enough to simply erase and forget. "I know that story well, Commander. I was told the exact same thing about myself only days ago. But every single person standing here is proof that story was always a lie, and lies have a way of becoming very expensive once enough people see through them at once." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved, the entire clearing suspended in a silence that felt like it might break in either direction at any second. Then, slowly, the commander lowered the hand that had drifted toward his weapon, his expression shifting from fury into something far more complicated, the particular discomfort of a man realizing the mission he had been sent to complete had already failed the moment it truly began. "This isn't over," he said finally, though the certainty in his voice had noticeably thinned. "You've only delayed what's coming." "Maybe," Ethan said, stepping up beside me, his voice calm and unshaken. "Or maybe you go home and explain to whoever sent you that Monster Valley isn't the empty grave your empire has always claimed it to be, and let them decide for themselves whether they truly want the rest of the galaxy asking why." The retreat that followed was slower this time, more deliberate, the commander clearly weighing consequences that extended far beyond the simple mission he had arrived with. As their ship finally lifted away from the valley floor and disappeared into the gray sky above, a sound rose from the gathered crowd around me. Not celebration exactly, but something quieter and more lasting, relief mixed with a new, hard-won confidence that had not existed in quite the same way before that morning. In the weeks that followed, life in the valley slowly settled back into its familiar rhythms, though something fundamental had shifted, an unspoken understanding that the isolation which had once felt like protection now felt more like readiness, a community no longer content to simply survive unnoticed, but prepared to be seen clearly, on its own terms, whenever the moment demanded it. I stayed. There had never truly been another choice worth considering, not once I understood what staying actually meant. I built a shelter of my own near the edge of Ethan's camp, learned slowly and steadily the countless small skills that turned survival into something closer to belonging, and found, more often than I expected, that the fear, which had once defined every waking moment since my exile, had been replaced by something sturdier, something closer to purpose. Months passed before the day came that mirrored my own arrival so closely, It stole the breath from my chest the moment I understood what I was witnessing. We heard the transport ship long before we saw it. The same distant hum that had once meant terror to me now simply meant attention, a signal worth investigating rather than fleeing. Ethan and I made our way toward the drop zone together, and arrived just as a small figure hit the wet ground hard, rolling, gasping, staring up at a sky the color of old bruises exactly as I once had. She was young, alien like me though, of a different species entirely, trembling with the particular terror of someone who had just been told nothing ever survived this place. I watched her push herself up onto shaking arms, watched her scan the mist around her for the monsters she had surely been warned about, and felt an old, familiar ache settle into my chest. I stepped forward into the clearing, Ethan beside me, and watched her eyes widen at the sight of us, two figures where the stories had promised only death. "You're going to be fine," I said, echoing words I would never fully stop being grateful someone once said to me. "First day out here is the hardest. After that, it gets easier." She stared at me, uncertain, terrified, exactly as I had once been, and somewhere behind that fear, I saw the same small stubborn spark I recognized from my own reflection days earlier, the part of a person that refuses, even at the very end of everything, to simply lie down and disappear. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who was thrown here too, once," I said, offering my hand the way it had once been offered to me, "and someone who's very glad they didn't turn back." Behind us, smoke rose steady and patient from the fire at our camp, the same thin gray line that had once given a frightened, broken girl a reason to keep walking instead of giving up. As she took my hand and rose unsteadily to her feet, I understood, with a clarity that settled deep and permanent into my bones, that Monster Valley had never truly been the graveyard the Empire built it to be. It had always, quietly and stubbornly, been something else entirely, a place where the discarded became the proof that no one, no matter how thoroughly they were thrown away, was ever truly disposable at all.